There is a silence that falls not when the world is asleep, but when it is holding its breath. It is a silence heavier than lead, denser than the deepest ocean trench. And in October of 1962, that silence descended upon the corridors of power in Washington and Moscow, threatening to suffocate the entire human race. We often look back at history as a series of inevitable events, a scripted play where the ending was already written in the ink of destiny. But this is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night. The truth is far more fragile. The truth is that for 13 days, the continued existence of civilization did not hang on grand strategies or the precise mathematics of ballistic trajectories, but on the exhausted, terrified minds of a handful of men staring into the abyss, knowing that one blink, one misinterpretation, one burst of pride would turn the Northern Hemisphere into a radioactive graveyard.
This was the moment when the Cold War, which had been a freezing contest of shadows and spies for nearly 2 decades, suddenly ignited into a blinding heat that scorched the very air in the Oval Office. To understand the gravity of those days, one must strip away the hindsight of survival. You must forget that you are living in a future that was never guaranteed. You must place yourself in the autumn of 1962. The world was already fractured, split down the middle by an iron curtain that was more than a metaphor. On one side, the United States, riding the wave of post-war prosperity but trembling with an undercurrent of paranoia. On the other, the Soviet Union, bruised but powerful, projecting an image of monolithic strength while concealing its own desperate insecurities. The arms race was not a statistic, it was a religion. Both superpowers had spent years stockpiling weapons of such grotesque power that they had to invent new language just to describe the devastation they could unleash. Terms like megaton and mutual assured destruction became part of the geopolitical lexicon. But until this October, the threat had always been somewhat abstract, a distant thunder on the horizon. The missiles were in Turkey, or in the vast steppes of Russia, hours away by flight. There was a buffer of time, a cushion of geography, that allowed leaders to believe they could manage a crisis. That cushion was about to be ripped away. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper of shutter clicks in the stratosphere. On the 14th of October, a U-2 spy plane, a spindly creature of titanium and long wings, drifted through the thin air over the island of Cuba. Below, amidst the lush green palms and the sugarcane fields, lay a secret that would shatter the peace of the world. The pilot, Major Richard Heiser, was merely doing a job, snapping photographs of the terrain, unaware that the film canisters he would bring back to Florida contained the death warrant of millions. When those images were developed and analyzed by the interpreters at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, the blood drained from the faces of men who were not easily frightened. They saw patterns in the dirt, specific geometric shapes of canvas covers, the layout of trailers and erectors that could only mean one thing. These were not defensive weapons. These were not supplies for the Cuban army. These were medium-range ballistic missiles, Soviet-made, nuclear-tipped, and capable of striking Washington, New York, or Chicago in less time than it takes to read a morning newspaper. The realization was a physical blow. For years, the Soviets had lagged behind in missile technology, their reach limited, their accuracy questionable. But by placing these weapons in the Caribbean, 90 miles from the coast of Florida, Nikita Khrushchev had effectively placed a knife against the throat of the United States. The strategic balance of power had not just shifted, it had been overturned overnight. When the news was brought to President John Fitzgerald Kennedy on the morning of October 16th, the air in the White House changed. It was no longer the seat of government. It became a bunker. The president, sitting in his pajamas on the edge of his bed, reviewing the photographs, understood immediately that his presidency, and perhaps the American experiment itself, was facing its terminal test. He called for his brother, Robert, and his most trusted advisors, a group that would come to be known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or ExComm. They gathered in the cabinet room, a long table surrounded by men in dark suits, surrounded by the ghosts of wars past. The mood was not one of heroic resolve, but of shock and anger. The Soviets had lied. Only weeks before, they had assured the administration, through diplomatic back channels and public statements, that no offensive weapons would be placed in Cuba. It was a deception of such magnitude that it left the American leadership reeling. The initial reaction from the military chiefs was swift and brutal. General Curtis LeMay, a man who saw the world through the crosshairs of a bomber sight, argued for an immediate, overwhelming airstrike to destroy the missile sites before they could become operational, followed by a full-scale invasion of the island. To the military mind, this was a problem of ballistics and force. If the enemy places a weapon near you, you destroy it. It was a logic of iron, cold and unyielding. But Kennedy hesitated. He was a student of history, and he knew something that his generals, in their hunger for action, often forgot. He knew that wars are easy to start and impossible to control. He knew that an airstrike on Cuba would kill Soviet technicians, Russian soldiers wearing the uniform of the Red Army. If American bombs killed Soviet citizens, Khrushchev would be forced to respond. He might attack Berlin, the eternal flashpoint in Europe. He might launch his own missiles, and then the dominoes would fall, one by one, until the final domino was the button that launched the intercontinental ballistic missiles. The room was divided, the arguments fierce. The clock was ticking, not in hours, but in the drying of concrete at the missile sites in San Cristobal. Every hour spent debating was an hour the Soviets used to make the weapons ready to fire. For days, the American public went about their lives in blissful ignorance. Children walked to school, fathers went to work, mothers shopped for groceries, all unaware that in a windowless room in Washington, men were discussing whether they would live to see another month. The secrecy was absolute. The president continued his public schedule, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, maintaining the facade of normalcy, while his mind was consumed by visions of mushroom clouds rising over American cities. He met with the Soviet foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, in the Oval Office during this period. It was a scene of surreal tension. Gromyko, with a stone face, assured Kennedy once again that Soviet aid to Cuba was purely defensive, purely for agriculture and land defense. Kennedy, sitting mere feet away, had the photographs of the nuclear missiles in his desk drawer. He did not produce them. He did not scream. He simply listened to the lie, watching the man's eyes, realizing that the game of diplomacy had ended and the game of survival had begun. This was the psychological burden that Kennedy bore, the knowledge of the lie, the knowledge of the threat, and the knowledge that any premature move could trigger the apocalypse. As ExComm debated, two main options emerged from the chaos of voices. The first was the airstrike, the path of war, advocated by the hawks who believed that strength was the only language the Soviets understood. The second was a naval blockade, a ring of ships around Cuba to prevent any further missiles from arriving. It was a softer option, a middle ground, but it was fraught with its own dangers. A blockade was technically an act of war. To stop a sovereign nation's ships on the high seas was a violation of international law. If a Soviet captain refused to stop, the Americans would have to fire, and if they fired, the war would begin at sea before spreading to land. The debate raged for days, fueled by coffee and stale smoke, tempers fraying as exhaustion set in. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, became the moral compass of the group, arguing passionately against a surprise airstrike. He invoked the memory of Pearl Harbor, refusing to let his brother become the Tojo of the 1960s. He argued that America stood for something more than just raw power, that a sneak attack on a small island would morally bankrupt the nation in the eyes of the world. Slowly, agonizingly, the president moved toward the blockade option. He called it a quarantine, a word that sounded medical, protective, less aggressive than blockade. It was a semantic shield for a military sword. On the evening of October 22nd, the secret could be kept no longer. The decision was made. The orders were cut. The military machine of the United States began to pivot toward the Caribbean. The president sat before the television cameras in the Oval Office, his face grave, his voice steady, but laced with an undeniable tension. Across the nation, families gathered around black and white sets, sensing that this was not a normal broadcast. When Kennedy spoke, his words were not the flowery rhetoric of a campaign. They were the cold, hard facts of impending doom. He told the American people and the world about the missiles. He showed the evidence. He announced the quarantine, and then he issued a warning to the Soviet Union that chilled the blood of every listener. He declared that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. There was no ambiguity. It was a direct threat of total nuclear war. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped the public. Supermarkets were stripped bare of canned goods and water. People wept in the streets. In schools, children were taught to duck and cover, a futile gesture against the heat of a sun unleashed on Earth, but it was all they had. The world suddenly felt very small and very fragile. In Moscow, the reaction was one of fury and confusion. Nikita Khrushchev had gambled. He had looked at the young American president and seen weakness. He had seen the failure at the Bay of Pigs a year earlier and assumed Kennedy would not have the stomach for a confrontation. He had miscalculated. Now he was cornered. His ships were steaming toward Cuba, carrying more weapons, and the American Navy was waiting for them. He had to decide whether to run the blockade and start World War III, or back down and lose face before the world and his own hardliners in the Kremlin. The days that followed the announcement were a blur of escalating readiness. The Strategic Air Command moved to Defense Readiness Condition 2, the highest level short of actual war. B-52 bombers, loaded with nuclear payloads, were kept in the air 24 hours a day, circling just outside Soviet airspace, waiting for the code to fly north and turn cities into ash. Intercontinental ballistic missile crews sat in their underground silos, keys around their necks, going through the checklists of launch, waiting for the order that would end the world. The ocean became a chessboard. Dozens of American destroyers and aircraft carriers formed a wall of steel in the Atlantic. Submarines lurked in the depths, listening for the cavitating screws of Soviet vessels. The tension was not just in the White House, it was in the sonar rooms, in the cockpits, on the bridges of destroyers, where 19-year-old sailors looked at the horizon and wondered if the sun would rise tomorrow. The first test of the quarantine approached as Soviet cargo ships neared the imaginary line drawn in the sea. In the Situation Room, Kennedy and his advisors waited, staring at maps, waiting for the teletype machines to chatter out the news of a collision. If the Soviet ships did not turn back, the orders were clear. Disable the rudders, board the ships, use force. It was a game of chicken played with nuclear weapons. The silence in the room was absolute. Every phone ring sounded like a gunshot. Kennedy, his back plagued by constant pain, his eyes shadowed by lack of sleep, knew that he had placed the ball in Khrushchev's court. He had given his adversary a choice, but he had also backed him into a corner. It was a strategy of maximum pressure, but it relied on the assumption that the man on the other side was rational, that he loved his children as much as Kennedy loved his own. That was the terrifying variable. Was the enemy rational, or were they driven by an ideology that welcomed martyrdom? As the hours ticked by, reports started to trickle in. Some Soviet ships had stopped. Some had turned around, but others continued. And beneath the waves, Soviet submarines, armed with nuclear torpedoes, a fact the Americans did not know at the time, were being hunted by U.S. destroyers dropping practice depth charges to force them to surface. The Soviet captains, cut off from Moscow, exhausted, breathing foul air, hearing the explosions against their hulls, had their hands on the keys to launch. They did not know if the war had already started. They were operating in the blind fog of conflict, where a single loud noise could be interpreted as the start of Armageddon. This is where the true horror of the crisis lay. not in the decisions made in the grand palaces of government, but in the sweaty, claustrophobic decisions of men in the field, men cut off from command, men scared and angry, holding the power of gods in their trembling hands. The blockade was holding, but it was porous. The missiles already in Cuba were still there, and work on them continued at a frantic pace. The U-2 flights showed the sites becoming operational day by day. The military chiefs pressed Kennedy harder. "The blockade is not enough," they said. "You must strike. We are running out of time. If those missiles become active, we lose our advantage. We must destroy them now." Kennedy held the line, but his grip was slipping. He knew that the quarantine was only a temporary measure. It stopped new weapons, but it did nothing to remove the ones already pointing at Washington. He needed a diplomatic breakthrough, a way out of the maze that didn't lead to a cliff. But the communications between Washington and Moscow were slow, taking hours to encrypt, transmit, translate, and deliver. In the age of supersonic missiles, diplomacy moved at the speed of a horse and carriage. The disconnect between the speed of destruction and the speed of negotiation was a chasm into which the world was falling. Tensions spiked when a low-level reconnaissance flight was fired upon by Cuban anti-aircraft guns. The rules of engagement allowed the American pilots to return fire, but they held back. Then the unthinkable happened. A U-2 flown by Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Anderson was killed instantly. The first blood of the crisis had been spilled. The American military had a standing plan. If a U-2 is shot down, we destroy the SAM site that fired. The generals looked to Kennedy, waiting for the order to retaliate. This was it, the provocation, the act of war. By all the rules of military engagement, the United States should have launched a massive airstrike immediately. The planes were fueled, the pilots were strapped in, the targets were marked. The world held its breath, waiting for the spark to ignite the atmosphere. On the morning of October 28th, the fever finally broke. Radio Moscow broadcast a message that stopped time itself. Premier Khrushchev announced the dismantling of the offensive weapons in Cuba. The Soviet ships turned back toward the horizon. In exchange, a secret promise regarding missiles in Turkey and a public pledge not to invade the island. It was a compromise forged in the fires of absolute terror. The strategic bombers returned to their bases, and the silence that descended upon the world was heavy with relief and exhaustion. We had looked directly into the furnace of atomic war, and at the final second, blinked. This crisis proved that our technology has outpaced our wisdom, yet it was human fear that ultimately saved us. A direct hotline now links the Kremlin to the White House, ensuring that miscalculation never again brings us this close to midnight. But the innocence of the age is gone forever. We continue to live beneath the sword of Damocles, fully aware that civilization is fragile, held together only by the restraint of fallible men. We survived not because we were strong, but because we were afraid.